Hello everyone, it's Elizabeth from the Smart Stitcher. In this week's tutorial we're going to take you through how to create a leather tassel. The tassels we're going to be creating are going to look a little bit like my beige and pink ones here. But once you know the method, you can vary the size and shape, make them longer, shorter, even go nice and tiny, and then you can sort of play about with it to your heart's content. So let's get into it. So these are the supplies that I'm using to create this project. The blade, when you're working with blades, it's always important to know your health and safety, to make sure you know where your fingers are and that you're not cutting towards you, and that you have a suitable surface to cut against, something that won't splinter and potentially cause harm. So always make sure you've got spare blades and the facility to dispose of them safely. The glue I'm using is just a universal Yoo-hoo glue, but any sort of contact adhesive or Evo stick or something like that, something a little bit stronger than just PVA, works very well for this project. I've got a bone folder because that's helpful when I'm creating my patterns, and the leather I'm using is quite soft. You want something that you can roll easily into a tassel shape. So if the leather bends and it rolls nicely and it feels soft in the hand, this is about 1.2, 1.3 mils thick, then that works really nicely for this tutorial. I've used a suede lining leather before. I've also used a slightly thicker suede, probably similar to the pink leather, so anything that you can roll easily is going to work for this project. So this is my monster tassel, which has a slightly longer fringe, and again that's all nice and soft. So as a sort of general guideline, if you can roll it, then you can use it for this particular project. The type of tassel that we're making actually rolls up on itself, so there isn't an internal mold or anything like that supporting it. Now I've got my two examples here on the table. The sort of main part of the tassel on the pink one is slightly wider, and on the beige tassel it's slightly shorter, and the difference is just a couple of centimetres. And that may depend on what type of tassel you want. Obviously if you want a sort of a skirt that's slightly fuller, you would want perhaps a sort of a wider fringe. If you didn't want as much fullness, you may prefer a slightly narrower fringe. The good thing with this technique is that once you know how to make your basic template, you can then, as I've mentioned, play about with it. So let's get on to our template. So I'm going to take you through how to make the template for the pink tassel, and I've got a piece of card here, piece of scrap card as it happens, and what the first thing I need to do is to even it up. So I'm just going to fold it in half, and I'm going to use a bone folder just to give me a really nice crease. First thing I need to do is to even up my card so that I get a nice even shape to my tassel. So I've got a blade in my scalpel, and what I'm going to do with my card folded is I'm just going to make a mark towards the edge, because I want to create a straight edge so that my scalpel has gone through both layers of card. I'm then going to use a ruler, and when you're using a ruler and a scalpel, particularly when you're using a scalpel, always make sure you've got a ruler that's metal, something that's very tough and that isn't going to be cut by the blade of the scalpel. So I'm going to line up the ruler with the two piercings that I've just made into the card, and that will give me a nice straight edge for the base of my tassel. There we go. And then I'm going to repeat that for the other edge, and that will give me a nice straight top. I haven't done any measurements yet because I just want to get a nice piece of rectangular shaped card to start with. So again, I'm just going to repeat that like I've done on my first side. Cut that off. Oops. Always make sure that you go through. Sometimes you've got to score a couple of times. Now to get an edge on this side, I'm just going to keep my card folded, and I'm going to probably go about 3, let's change over as I'll confuse myself, so I'm going to go about 9 centimetres away from the fold of the ruler, and this will just help me get my edges. So this time, rather than cutting across the fold, I'm just going to cut along the length, sort of from the top to bottom, matching up my marks again. So using the blade of my scalpel as a guide, and then we just trim off that excess. Now we're going to start our measurements. So I know that I want my tassel to be 10 centimeters in height. So overall, when it's finished, apart from that loop, we want 10 centimeters. So I'm going to make sure that I fold up again, and this time I'm going to measure 10 centimeters down from that top section. So I just want to make sure that my ruler is nice and level, and I'm going to make a little piercing on that 10 line. So I know now that I've got the height of my tassel sorted. The next thing I'm going to add on is a line that is 2.5 centimeters down in depth, just to give me where the position of where the sort of a collar of my tassel is going to sit. So again, I'll fold and I'll pierce. So I'm going to just measure 2.5 centimeters from the edge, make my mark, and this time I'm not going to use my knife. I'm going to just join that with my pencil. So now we're getting our sort of tassel starting to take shape. I know that I want a tassel that is a little bit more full, so I'm going to make sure I go over the halfway point with the measurements. I find it quite useful to have, or to almost make the section that's going to be wrapping around the top of our tassel just a little bit longer, because you can always trim it off. So I'm going to start off just by marking. Let's start with our 10 centimeters, and you can make your tassel fringing as narrow or as wide as you like. I quite like sort of 0.5 centimeter intervals, so I'm now just going along my line with my pencil, marking those every 0.5 centimeter, and that will give me a fringe of about 20 sort of pieces in my fringe. So I've marked from the sort of the very top there. I'm now going to repeat again slightly lower down and make sure that I've got all of my marks in. So I've got all of my marks are now in position. I've got 0.5 centimeter marks at the top, 0.5 centimeter at the bottom. For the purposes of our tutorial, I'm actually going to draw the lines in, and then I'm going to be making the holes to make my marks when I draw onto the leather. So as you're going along, just check that your lines are straight, and certainly it can sometimes, if you're doing lots of lines, you can run the risk of your ruler going off at a slight angle. So always just keep an eye on your lines, make sure that they are nice and straight. So we've got our lines now all drawn in, and I'm going to just have a piece of cork underneath my card, because I now want to pierce through on the line, almost on the intersection where the line and the vertical and the horizontal lines meet, because these are the holes I'm going to be making, in order that when we draw on, I can put the tip of my pen through these holes to mark the leather. So we're just working our way along. You want to, I'm sort of just almost sort of a fraction below my horizontal line, just to allow for a little thickness of the awl, and I'm just working my way along. So I'm going to finish the top row and then going to repeat on the bottom row, and again it's about making sure that I'm on that line. That's going to be really important, because obviously we're joining them up when we cut them. A little tip when you're making holes is I find that once I've pushed the awl through from one side, I turn the card over and I come back through just to really open up the hole. I find it just gives me a slightly broader hole and a slightly better space with which to put the tip of my pen through to make a mark. So I'm going to repeat that now, just going all the way along the top line, all the way along the bottom line, so they're nice and open. All my holes are pierced, and I'm now ready to draw around my template on my leather. So I've then, once I've finished piercing my holes, I cut out the little square of leather that was just there, and that now gives me the shape of my tassel template. So I've got that onto a nice piece of leather. I've avoided some of the marks that were in the leather, and this is, I'm happy with that sort of position. Now whatever you just decide to mark your leather with, you always want to make sure that you can remove it from the leather. or cut inside of the lines. So I know with my silver pen that I can very easily remove it from the leather with a baby wipe. So I'm going to be using that now to draw around my tassel template. So I'm just going to go all the way around the outside, following the lines. If at any point my pen sort of swerves off, I can always just sort of reset it and continue the straight line. And I'm just going to work my way around. The next thing, once I joined up the outline, is to go through each of the holes with the tip of the pen and just to make a mark on the leather. And I want just enough of a mark so that I can see where I'm going to be cutting after I've marked all my holes. So just take a moment, do your outline, but very carefully make sure that you have gone through each of your holes, and you might just need to lift your template up to do a little check on that. So we're all drawn on, and the next thing to do is to cut our leather out. So we've got rid of all of that excess, and then we're ready to start cutting into the skirt of our tassel. Always make sure that you are safe with the knives that you're using. Always use something with a metal edge when you're drawing a scalpel alongside of it, so that nothing runs the risk of there are no risk of splinters. Also make sure that you know where your fingers are, so that you're not drawing the blade towards your finger at any point, or you're not pointing to any part of your body when you are cutting. So I'm using the metal ruler. I'm going to be just applying a little bit of downward pressure, and I want to draw the blade through the leather so that I get a nice crisp line. So I'm just coming inside of my pen mark to just beyond where my line has finished. Now, paper and card can make your blades go blunt very, very quickly, so I've just put a fresh blade in, and you do notice the difference when you're cutting the leather. If your blade starts to drag, it may be that it's not as sharp as it should be, so you may wish to put a new blade in, otherwise you run the risk of potentially damaging the leather. And when sometimes you'll know your blade is blunt if you get a particularly sort of jagged edge. So I'm just going to trim off all of my excess bits, and then I'm going to come back in and we're going to trim off we're going to open up our tassel skirt. I'm not going to trim it off, my goodness, that would be terrible. Now, if you're a bit worried about cutting into the corner here, I would always advise sort of cutting away from a corner, which can be a bit tricky. I tend to like the ruler protecting the leather that I'm going to be using, so that if I do happen to waver off, then I can I'm going to waver into my excess rather than into the leather I want to use. It can help sometimes just to punch a small hole in the corner, so that when I come the other way I know where to stop to prevent any sort of under or over cutting. So that's a useful little tip to have in your back pocket if you need it. Now, I tend to like to cut, as I say, with the excess away, but for this particular one I'm going to just double check that. I want to come away from my corner, so I'm going to just do that. That's why I've changed it round, and then we'll come away like so. Now, sometimes you can find that when you start to open up the skirt, sometimes the leather can sort of wriggle and move a little bit, or if your blade is getting blunt, sometimes I find that as I'm drawing my blade along the leather, it sometimes squidges out a little bit because I'm having to apply a little bit more pressure because I know I'm not cutting as cleanly. So if you feel that, if you notice your tassel fringing is starting to get a little bit wavy, change your blade. So all I'm going to do now is just start at my top mark, and I'm going to draw the blade along, coming down the leather to open up the skirt, just like that. And we're going to repeat, opening up all of our dots and just keeping an eye on our ruler to make sure that our tassel skirting is as evenly spaced as we can get it. Now, I've opened up the skirt, and I've also cut an additional strip which is about 8 centimeters by half a centimeter. And that little strip is going to be my hanging loop. So when I roll everything together, I'm going to be attaching it to the top inside of my tassel as we roll everything together. Now, when I'm creating a tassel, I quite like to sort of overlap with the bit where the collar starts and sort of go a little bit further round, but you can have this section as long as you wish. We are going to be gluing it, but before we glue it, what I would like to do is just to thin down this edge a little bit, so that when it wraps round, it's very, very fine, very, very thin, and you then don't have much of a bump on the edge there. So when we come to sort of glue it, that's how we want our tassel to look, like this one when it's finished. But before I do, what I'm going to do is thin down this edge, and I'm also, with my sandpaper, I'm going to just rough up the top of this leather here, because we want to create a surface on which the glue will adhere and stick to. I'm also going to rough the surface as well of the sections of my hanging loop that will be above the leather. So probably about from there down, I'm going to be sandpapering the surface of the leather, and that just gives us a surface on which the glue can then stick to. So my surface, I've just keyed it, so the leather, where it was a little bit shiny before, it's now feels a little bit more sort of matte, and I can tell that I've just used sandpapered it because it's not quite as smooth as it was. I've also marked on my template the section that I'm going to be tapering. So on the underside of my leather, I'm just going to be shaving off probably from about that sort of last centimetre from the end, just to try and get a really nice, narrow, very, very thin edge right at the edge there to then overlap. When you are paring the leather, I find it useful to use a scalpel, but to always work away from myself, and I'm just going to very carefully just shave off little bits of the leather at a time. So I'm not going to go in and sort of try and take out a massive wedge of leather or anything like that. I want this to be nice and smooth, and a little bit at a time, rather than trying to sort of cut off anything too much in one go. So you may find that you will need to sort of change blades, make sure that your leather is always being cut with a nice fresh blade. So I managed to taper my end. I've probably gone back a little bit more than a centimetre actually, just to sort of get sort of the wider part of the taper going down to something that's really, really fine at the sort of the very, very sort of tip of the leather there, so that when it wraps round, we want it to be not quite seamless, but as seamless as we can get it. So the first thing we need to do is to glue in our little strap, and then we are going to start wrapping our tassel. If you are planning on making your tassel into a keyring, now is the time to have your keyring handy. I'm using a sort of a general purpose adhesive, but any sort of stronger adhesive, contact adhesive, anything which gives you a very strong bond is great to use for this particular project. So the first thing I'm going to do is to start to glue my loop in, and I'm just going to add a little bit of glue to there, and this is where some scrap pieces of card can be handy, because if you kind of find you've added a lot of glue, you can scoop it off and use it as a bit of a spatula to help spread the glue and add it elsewhere. So the first thing I'm going to do is just to glue that rough sidebar. I've sandpapered it, and I'm going to tap it down and glue it into position here. Now I'm going to make this into a key ring, so I'll make sure that my ring is over the end, and then I'm going to just apply a little bit of glue, almost like it is a contact adhesive really, because I want a really strong bond to keep everything together. And sometimes when you've got a new glue, it's hard if you squeeze the tube a little bit too hard, you get lots of glue out. So it's handy to have your scrap bits of card ready, because you can then pop your bits of glue that have fallen out onto those scrap pieces. So we've got our loop glued into position. You can, if you wish, make your loop part of the tassel and give it a longer fringe, or you can keep it shorter. Again, you know, you can play about with it. That's the nice thing about this kind of little project. So the next thing I'm going to do is to start rolling. Now as I start rolling after I've glued, I want to keep my top edge nice and level. So I'm going to add some glue, and we might need to sort of spread it out again. And I'm going to be working my way along to where the fringe finishes in that first instance. So I've just added some glue there. Just going to spread it out a little bit more, and then we're going to roll. So I'll just get my card out of the way, and as I'm rolling, again, just be really careful. I don't want my tassel to be loose, so I'm just getting my fingers in to make sure as I'm rolling the tassel I'm almost sort of giving it a squeeze together so that I can keep that top nice and level. And then this is nice and tight, so there's no kind of loose bit, and then I'm going to roll up. There we go. So that's, I'm happy with that so far. Now what I'm going to do is just apply some glue against this rough side, but stop at my taper. So the back of the leather, sorry, is what I'm applying the glue to now, and I'm going to add a little bit onto my sanded area as well, just to help get everything to stick. And then we'll just give that a little spread about. Now you'll notice, and I'll tell you why, I've stopped just short of the taper, because I want to glue that last of all to make sure that I cover all of those edges. So this time I'm now just holding under a little bit of tension as I wrap the rest of the collar around the top of the tassel. And then we get to that last bit. So I know now that I've got a really good kind of roll here, that I'm happy with that. Now what I want to do is make sure that I get glue all the way to these edges and a little bit on this side as well. So if I can just sort of almost mark and just give my paper, my leather, a little bit more of a sand, so I go up to the marker where I've got my thumb, because we want this now to really stick. So I'm going to apply glue to both surfaces, making sure that I'm sort of in that little well there between the two pieces of leather. And in order to get right to the edges, I'm probably applying a little bit more glue than I need, and I'm just going to use my piece of card to help me scrape the glue out towards these edges, because we want them to stick down. Now with a contact adhesive, if you have a little bit too much, you can sort of rub it off afterwards, and I'll show you what I mean in just a second. So I'm happy now that I've got lots of glue covering my edges. I've worked out to make sure that all of my edges are covered, and I'm now going to wrap this around, keeping it again under a little bit of tension. It's going to slide a little bit, so keep everything nice and flat, and I'm just going to tap that down. There we go, and we can just allow it to set. So I'm just going to keep it under a little bit of pressure for a moment, and then you will, or you should hopefully see that it's set quite quickly. Now the adhesive, obviously if you're using this, you don't want to get every adhesive everywhere, because it's really quite annoying to get off sometimes. Sometimes using a piece of crepe or a rubber, you can help and just gently rub off any excess glue. It's quite a useful way, a useful tip really, having a piece of, and it's just a little bit of scrap crepe. You can buy them on the internet, and they're just quite useful for getting the glue off. But get the glue off sooner, don't let it dry, because it will be much harder to get off, if at all. And anything we're doing here, what we don't want to do is to damage the surface of the leather. So I'm just going to give that a little bit more of a polish up. So this particular tutorial just covered the sort of a gluing method, but you can of course add a separate collar that you might stitch on as well, and I shall cover that in a future tutorial. But there we have it, our finished gorgeous tassel, all ready to use. So have fun, play about with it, make this your own, and you know, who knows, you could add paint effects, you could add all sorts, but enjoy.